Widely regarded as a pioneer in the field of science and technology studies and the creator of the concept of cognitive justice, Shiv Visvanathan is an eminent intellectual and a distinguished social scientist of the country. Presently a professor at the Jindal Global Law School and the executive director of Center for the Study of Knowledge Systems at OP Jindal Global University, Sonipat, Haryana, Viswanathan has a distinguished academic career that spans about 40 years, during which he has been a professor at the Dhirubhai Ambani Institute of Information and Communication Technology, Gandhinagar, India, a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi, and a faculty at the Delhi School of Economics. He has also held visiting professorships at various prestigious universities abroad and has been a distinguished member of the Lokayan and the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, among others. He is a columnist with The Hindu, The New Indian Express, The Indian Express, The Deccan Chronicle, and The Asian Age, among others. His articles have been published in Outlook, India Today, Open, among others, and he has penned 3 books, namely Organizing for Science, 1985, A Carnival for Science, 1997, and Theatres of Democracy 2016, and has co-edited Foul Play, Chronicles of Corruption 1999. So, it is indeed a privilege and an honor for us and that you have taken out time from your busy schedule to be here with us. May I now request you to kindly deliver the lecture. Thank you.
Friends, I feel like an imposter here. First, because I'm envious. When I see so many literary people, a social scientist always feels a bit jealous. Because social scientists are poor storytellers. Secondly, I feel a bit embarrassed to talk about a man I've never met, but whose stature seems to grow every day, Munin Barkotoki. So what I'm going to do today is to pretend I'm having a conversation with him. Adding to it 2 other people, 2 great literary figures whom I knew well and who influenced my life, U.R. Anantmurthy and Mahashweta Devi. The topic I'm going to use is quite simple. In the last few months before U.R. Anantmurthy died, he wrote a brilliant book, a pamphlet, which is aptly timed. He said, "Why I do not want to live in a Modi's India." And I think it was one of the finest things he wrote. And before he died, he also asked me, as one of his students, to write the foreword to it. I think there Anantmurthy captured the role of the writer. For a man like Anantmurthy, political parties were significant. But writers were more powerful because writers constituted the real opposition in a democracy. Today, when BJP sweeps 300 seats in UP, the role of the writer becomes much more significant. He is, in fact, going to be the future opposition. And Anantmurthy also said something very interesting. He said, storytelling is not enough. You need a different kind of truth-telling, a different kind of truth-telling where the writers get together and become the new Constituent Assembly. You need a new kind of constitution around the formal constitution. And one of the things he suggested to me as a social scientist was to invent a futuristic constitution based on what storytellers might have done if they had written the constitution. The second, and it's this that I'm going to do. For a man like Anantmurthy and the book he wrote, one of the greatest failures of storytelling was the official idea of development. He said development is not an economic category. Development is bad literature. Development is a failure of storytelling. He said when you have a society where 40 million people are displaced by dams and 10 million people by riots, there is a failure of storytelling. There's a failure to understand the very categories we talk about. And I think the same point was made brilliantly by Mahashweta Devi when in fact she told me the story of one of her great short stories, The Pterodactyl. It's a brilliant story that takes place in famine-ridden Bihar in the 60s. Suddenly a journalist, very modern, very developmental, enters the scene in Purnia. And he hears that a tribal has met a strange bird. He discovers it's a pterodactyl. And his modernist soul cannot believe that this dinosauric creature has returned, and this tribal is sitting in a kind of affinity to this bird. The tribal, in fact, says, my cousins have come home. The journalist doesn't understand. He says, what was the affinity between this strange bird, which went extinct 50 million years ago, and this tribal? And at that moment, he understands something very significant. He realizes there is an affinity, a closeness, a citizenship between the pterodactyl and the tribal to which he doesn't belong. It's the journalist as modernizer who's the alien. Mahashweta captures something brilliant here, because what she tries to show is the same thing Anantmurthy once showed, that democracy takes place in multiple time. I remember Anantmurthy once going to Ingmar Bergman's movie with his PhD guide Ray Bradbury. After the movie, they had a strange discussion. Anantmurthy told Malcolm Bradbury, that when a Westerner needs to go to the past, he goes to an archive. When an Indian needs to go to the past, he goes next door. We have a multiplicity of time. And it's these neighborhoods of time that need to be represented. Our formal constitution has no understanding of time. It has no record of storytelling. Let's take a simple example. You can talk of India as a peaceful nation which won a peaceful nationalism. Or you can talk of India as the only nation created by two genocides in history. Partition, which eliminated 1.6 million people, and the Bengal famine, which no one talks about, which eliminated 3 million people. It is these two genocides that actually created the modern Indian state. When you look at it, when you look at truth-telling and storytelling as ways to write the history of nationalism and the nation state, things change. How do we respond to this kind of crisis? And I want to do this by pretending. In fact, it is very interesting. When Anantmurthy wrote this book, Why I Don't Want to Stay in Modi's India, Giriraj Kishore of the BJP told him, Anantmurthy deserves to be on the train to Pakistan. And Anantmurthy was delighted. He said, the train to Pakistan. What a brilliant metaphor. It began as a story of genocide. Today, it's a metaphor for all the greats of the dissenting imagination. All the great writers should be on the train to Pakistan, because it's this train that, through its nature of storytelling, which will talk about the India of the future. I hope you are there. Let me push this further. This is really all I'm going to try to do. If a group of storytellers were to rewrite the Indian Constitution, how would they go about it? What new metaphors, what new languages, what new stories would be captured? And why do you need this? Because I think in a deep and fundamental way, the Constitution is tone deaf to storytelling. Our ideas of development haven't had a simple idea of the pain, the suffering, the languages in which pain have been articulated. Let me just give 4 simple examples. A few months back, in Orissa, where the mining takes place, a waterfall died. The tribals were distraught. Talking to some of my friends, they said, a myth died today. A way of life died today. A waterfall died today. They said, what do? We are in complete distress, because it's almost as if a cosmology had collapsed. They said, how do you think of a waterfall? How does a constitution think of the death of a waterfall? And I remember going back to Delhi and looking at one of my economist colleagues who said, waterfall? That's only so many cusecs of water. Between the secular economistic idea of this man And the dream of the waterfall, as visualized by the tribal, stands a constitutional gap. Let me push this further. I remember when my friend Medha Patkar, long after the defeat of the Narmada, anti-Narmada movement, was taking a Jal Samadhi. She and about 100 others immersed themselves in the water and lay in silence. The media ignored them for almost 20 days. The silence itself was dramatic. What is it about India that forgets this? What is it about India that forgets the stories of what happened in the last days of the Narmada Dam when army jeeps moved in? I remember one of my friends talking about a tribal leader. They said, move. He said, I can't. The army man said, why not? He said, my ancestors are buried here. When my ancestors are buried here, I want to be buried here. The pity is the Narmada Dam officials never understood the story. So in first case, what we have is a question of the language of development, and the language of the constitution cannot understand what's happening in India. In the second, we have a failure of memory. In fact, I remember what the Narmada Dam did in desperation. It produced a calendar of the Narmada movement. Date, time of every struggle. But the sadness is, as Medha said, development is an act of forgetting. Development is erasure. And development, because it destroys the lives of the people, destroys the autobiographies of the people. In a deep and fundamental way, the tragedy of development is it's a failure of storytelling. The third example was even more exciting. It happened close by. It's when tribals in the Arunachal River, Arunachal, refused to let a certain water project take place because the black-necked cranes were coming there. And they said, you can't do anything to them because this is the 6th incarnation of the Dalai Lama. Not for an economist to confront this kind of situation, talking about cost-benefit, what does the 6th incarnation of the Dalai Lama mean? And yet to these people, they were talking about myth and metaphor of cosmology as a daily part of their lives. Development, as Anant Murthy and Mahashweta said, deeply and fundamentally has no understanding of our people. So the question I've addressed myself to is very simple. Imagine if Anant Murthy, Mahashweta Devi, Munin Barkotoki were members of the Constituent Assembly, built today. As storytellers, how would they create the new, I'm going to call it the tacit constitution? The metaphors, the models, the dreams, the alternatives which can create a different version of Indian society. I think we have spent too long on thinking of democracy as something to do with elections. True. But elections won't get you far. All it will get you is the kind of majoritarian regime we have today. I think democracy is also a kind of storytelling. It's a kind of truth-telling. It tries to keep varieties of imagination alive. The nature of representation isn't electoral. The nature of representation is when the storyteller captures the truth of different societies within it. In fact, one of my friends put it brilliantly. I asked him, what do you think storytelling is? He turned around and said, how many varieties of rice does India have? In that time, I was not much of a historian of science. And I said, 100, 1,000, casually. He said, you don't understand. India is the repository of 150,000 varieties of rice. 150,000 notions of myth, cooking, dreaming, storytelling. If India doesn't keep 150,000 varieties of rice alive through various acts of storytelling, democracy will be dead. The democracy of rice. Not just as a staple food, not just as an art of cooking, but as the varieties of myth that sustain a democracy. Democracy is not sustained by theories of citizenship. Democracy is sustained by cosmologies that dream of a different kind of myth. And so I'm going to begin with this simple proposition. And let me tell you, most of these were actually attempted by social movements. One of the first things I want to propose is that we need a different notion of time. The Constitution is written in linear time. And linear time is a very poor time for storytelling. It has no notion of memory. In fact, I remember a friend of mine telling me, you know what's wrong with the Brundtland report? Brundtland has one kind of time. My tribal, whom I study for a shifting cultivation, has 20 varieties of time. You cannot create a theory of sustainability without 20 varieties of time. When time is impoverished, sustainability is impoverished. And when sustainability is impoverished, the possibilities of democracy die. And it's in this context that I want to first propose that democracy be constructed in multiple time. That history, myth, past, present, future all coexist. Because deeply and fundamentally, till we have a notion of multiple time, you can't have storytelling. You can't begin once there was. Because history is much more specific, much more formal. What we need is a nation of storytellers to sustain our constitution. Why do I emphasize this? In many ways, the Constitution is an enlightenment entity. We talk about liberty, equality, and I think we spent a lot of time on it. But we never thought of fraternity and diversity. And if you look at the Indian Constitution, one of the great things storytellers do is to sustain diversity. Which brings me to the question of language. Your Antipati summarized the tragedy brilliantly once to me. He said, what do I do when an illiterate in India speaks 5 languages and a convent school girl speaks 1? I think what he was trying to emphasize was something different which was made by another protege of his, Ganesh Devi. When India defined a language as a form of life which has a script, in one day we destroyed 2,000 languages. 2,000 oral languages disappeared that day. 2,000 forms of imagination. It was probably one of the greatest acts of linguicide in history. What happens when you destroy orality? Because the Indian writer is not just a creature of the text. He owes a certain kind of social contract to orality. He has to work out a different relation to digitality. Mere text cannot guarantee the creativity of writing. And it's in this context that many of my social science and literary friends have proposed we need a constitution in multiple time. We need also to think of a new relation between orality, textuality, and digitality. India has to be in multiple time and in multiple mediums to be a democracy. The standardized democracies of the West are no use. Let me push it further. I think one of the things that's really startling is there's been no narrative or history of the body in India. The relation between the body and the body politic stands as one of the crucial issues of modern literature. Take any of the great problems today. Feticide. Indian feticide is now very close to the statistics of the Nazi Holocaust. We eliminate about 500,000 quite competently. The commoditization of body parts. 3 million people involved in sexual and child trafficking. If you look at the question of torture, if you look at all the histories of the body and the multiple histories of the body, you need a new narratology of the body. Without the notion of the body and the storytelling around the body, it's not just a question of gender. Democracy will not survive. The amount of people disappearing every day in India is stunning. I work on disasters. At least 10 to 20,000 people disappear through disasters. There's no record of them. There's no census of them. The disappearance of the body is a stunning fact. And it has no stories, no storyteller. You need a history of the body to begin the history of democracy all over again. Look at our silence about the body in partition. Today we have written a transfer of power. We haven't yet written a history of the partition. Because the history of the partition is a deep and fundamental way a question of the displacement of the body and the question of rape. It's a question of murders we haven't yet talked about. My old teacher Ashish Nandi had this brilliant story of the ifs and buts of the partition around the body. It deals with a small village near Lahore. A Sikh family realizes it's surrounded by Muslims. And the grandfather decides that he will not let anyone die with dishonor. He takes his kirpan, asks his sister to stand first. And in the next half an hour, he kills 52 members of the family. This is a true story. Then the grandfather goes out because suddenly the last child, the grandchild says, I will fight with you. Let me come and live. They step out to the village. And in the beginning, they thought they were going to be lynched. When suddenly an old man in the crowd said, this is the family that helped us in time of trouble. The villagers let them go. But at that moment, the grandfather had to ask whether his ritual execution of 50 people made sense. The grandson commits suicide. Before that, he told Ashish Nandi's story. This question of the body haunts history. I remember Shefali Vasudev, the journalist, once telling me, look, you got to come and meet this guy. He's watching this awful movie 52 times. It was Border. And this man was sitting and watching it because only way he could replay the memories of what happened in the partition. The story of the body, the story of the multiple bodies of the partition. The failure of storytelling in India is the silence about the partition. I think in a deep and fundamental way, the Constitution will not open up till we revisit the partition. The Constituent Assembly didn't, because to a certain extent the Muslim League wasn't present and Gandhi was too busy at Noakhali. So in a deep and fundamental way, the question of the partition, the question of the relation between body and body politics haunts us to this day. But probably the most sensational question is, I think, the question of nature. Of late, there's been a great deal of debate whether nature can be part of the Constitution. Nature today is more than cosmology, it's livelihood, it's lifestyle, it is the commons. And one of the most interesting movements in recent times has been to show, can the nature acquire a certain constitutionality? Because if you look at the violence taking place in India, it is about the destruction of nature. And I think this becomes fundamental. One of the most interesting propositions, in fact, was made was that large forms of nature acquire representation. Let me break down the proposition to you. I think it will be a constitutional delight if the Brahmaputra were represented in a Bill of Rights. Because the Brahmaputra is not just a river, it's a way of life. And this is not something merely argued by Indian activists. If you look at it, the first man to argue this was the American judge, William O. Douglas, who said large forms of nature represent large forms of life, lifestyle, livelihood, imaginations. These imaginations, because they represent the collective livelihood of a people, need representation. And I think we have to now think of a different kind of constitution, a parliament of technologies, a representation of rivers to revisit the constitution. Citizenship cannot be restricted to singular individuals. And I think when you start exploring the stories of the Indian life, the presence of the river, not just Ganges, but the Brahmaputra, the Indus, I think all need representation in the constitution. Each is a story. Each is an epic story. Each as an epic story needs representation in the constitution. And I think what we then do is we look at economics. We look at nature differently. I don't think we have the language of sustainability today. How do you create the language of sustainability? It can't be created to cost-benefit economics. How do you talk of suffering that sustainability creates? You need a different kind of storytelling. You need a kind of storytelling that Mahashweta Devi used when she talked about the problem of Purnia, the problem of an oral society in a textual world. What happens when nature keeps disappearing? Who represents nature? A standard notion of rights won't do. You need myth and cosmology to come back into the Constitution. The Constitution needs a literary touch. Because if we're obtaining a literary touch, it acquires not fictions, but fictions which are real enough to create a realistic constitution. Our people are dying. Nature is dying. Bodies are being destroyed, but there's no representation in the constitution. An act of storytelling changes the very dimension of constitutional life. In fact, the other day, maybe the last 2 years, I've been spending my time reading Dalit literature. And I was trying to understand, do we write about Dalit literature only in terms of anger? Or does it have something more to offer? And at that time I was reading Arvindam's essay on the drum. It's about this Dalit, half-deaf, making a drum. Arvindam describes the rituals in great detail. And then he plays the drum. I remember Gayatri Spivak's question, can the subaltern speak? I think Arvind says, don't worry about speech. The subaltern can drum. And the way the tribal drums is stunning in its musicality. What Dalit sociology really does is to take the arid nature of Indian planning and science and give it a sensorium. Because of the words they use, touch, taste, smell comes back. Memory comes back. In fact, when you read Arvindam's story, you realize to a certain extent he's recreating a sensorium which the aridity of Brahmin literature has lost. The power of it is stunning. It gives you a different kind of memory, a different sense of touch and smell. A constitution which has an unconscious sensorium, which can smell, touch, taste in a different way. It will change the very nature of planning. Our smart cities don't know how to smell. They don't even know how to remember. But a city with a sensorium becomes a different entity. In fact, I remember meeting Beswada Wilson, the Magsaysay Award winner, recently. He laughed. And in his sort of drawl of a South Indian accent, he said, Swachh Andolan, okay. Remember, at the end of every Swachh Andolan product is a septic tank. And the Dalit cleans the septic tank. Till you remove the sense of stink and sewage around the narrative of the Swachh Andolan, you have no justice and you have no hygiene. And he said that's a paradox. Today we are beating up Dalits because they're impure, and we're also beating up for not cleaning up the carcasses because they refuse to do so. What Wilson and others are suggesting is, what if the Constitution had a sensorium? A different way of looking at touch, taste and smell, not just reducing it to a question of pollution and purity. A different dream. And when you read some of the Dalit literature, you understand the power of the sensorium in transforming a democracy. When citizens taste, touch, smell and remember, you're creating a different world of democracy. The last thing I want to emphasize is language. I used to work for years with U.R. Ananthamurthy at Hegudu. And I remember once when I was watching a piece of theatre, they were enacting Bertolt Brecht's Crime of Galileo. M.B. Subbana, who was there, who was in fact charge of the theatre, came and told me something fascinating. He said, do you know Brecht has been performed, Crime of Galileo, has been performed more times in Malayalam than in German. It's true. So I said, fantastic. He said, no, that's not the important thing. He said, you've got to realize a truth to be true has to be said in two languages. Brecht is truer in Malayalam. The necessity and plurality of languages, the question of translation becomes of constitutional importance. Ananthamurthy, in fact, said one of the first things we have to do is to create a new kind of UNESCO where regional languages are translated into regional languages without waiting for the mediation of English. Maybe the Barkotoki Foundation can look at this, because the question of translation becomes a powerful issue in democracy. Don't wait to be mediated by English. Translate directly. Talk about a different world. And it's this pluralities that leads me to something else. Today I was kind of depressed with the results. I confess I'm very anti-BJP. And I remember something my old teacher, Rajni Kothari, once told me. Years ago, Center used to be responsible for election studies. And N.T. Rama Rao had just come to power. And I said, an opposition. Rajni smiled and said, what opposition? Just remember, as a writer, you're always in opposition. It doesn't make a difference where you come to power. And I understood the profundity of what he was saying. It is not opposition for the sake of opposition, but the writer, as one who creates imaginaries, who creates dreams, alternatives, is perpetually in the opposition. And I think today is a fantastic moment for the writer to take over the logic of the opposition. I can almost smell the silence. But what I'd like to propose is, this is the challenge facing us today. At a time when parties, possibly caught in the electoral logic, look helpless, or when young political leaders refuse to grow up, the writer as shaman, as storyteller, as custodian of memory becomes central. A new constitution, a new form of storytelling, which I think requires a different way of looking at dissent. Look at the words we use today. They're all governmental words, official words. They march in line and literally salute you. Patriotism, development. Each of them is official. Yet there's no place for dissent. I remember URA once telling me, the beauty of India is it's a composed heap of imaginations. The last Victorian and the last Marxist will survive in India. That is the power of the dissenting imagination. Because deeply and fundamentally, the very nature of storytelling will not allow them to die. I believe you knew him very well. So I can imagine you virtually imagining how he used to tell these stories. And I want to push this a bit further. I'm not just talking about minority imaginations. I'm talking about defeated imaginations, obsolescent imaginations, dissenting imaginations, and even alternative imaginations. I've been spending 10 years writing a book on the debates on science and Indian nationalism. It's nothing like what the officials say it is. Just let me give you a series of examples, because the nationalism was the availability of eccentricity. Where else would you find a national movement so hospitable to the British? Where else would you have someone say, Alan Octavian Hume was the father of the Congress? Where else would you have Annie Besant becoming president of the Congress? In fact, it's really brilliant, because I think Gandhi understood it. When an American journalist asked him, what do you think of Western civilization? He said it would be a good idea. And I think deeply and fundamentally, I'm reminded of O.V. Vijayan's cartoon, where Gandhi comes back with his traditional walking stick, and Vijayan asks him, what do you think of Indian civilization? And Gandhi says, that would also be a good idea. And I think it's time that democracy and the battle of civilization is reworked through the art of storytelling, through the nature of listening, through the minimization of violence, through the creation of a different kind of diversity. I think this is the task before us. And I want to also add one thing. Recently I was watching the debates in JNU on nationalism. And at the same time, I was spending some time working on the World Futures Congress. I remember Rajni Kothari, when he inaugurated it, told me something interesting. He said the idea of future is perfectly important. And I said, why? He said, this was when Soviet Russia was still dominant. He said, all the great dissenting minds of Europe will be present at your Congress because the Stalinists don't care for the future. Randavan Richter, Kolakowski, name it, they were all there. And it's at that moment I realized the future as a possibility itself is a part of the dissenting imagination. But Milos added something interesting. Recently someone told him he was not a patriot. And he says, an intellectual can never be a patriot. The act of treason is present in the very act of writing. Because as a writer and intellectual, you're not loyal to the official. You're loyal and committed to the future of your concept, to the future of your ideal, which can only emerge through storytelling. The writer has a dissenting imagination is already anti-national. He need not worry about being arrested. But if he stops telling the story in the variety of languages we need, in the forms of translation we require, with the kind of memory which is now being erased, then these kind of movements become worthless and meaningless. And my request to you, as a bad storyteller, is to ask better storytellers to sustain the dream of democracy. Thank you. Questions?